In my day job as an employment lawyer for large tech companies, I've done dozens and dozens of interviews over the last few decades. And it would surprise you how many people make, one of these three, obvious mistakes that are automatic door closers for them to advance in the interview process. But before I get to the three things that are just absolute interview killers, I'm going to go over the things that are things you must do or should do. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those because they're pretty obvious and they're in like every, interviewing video resource out there. So number one is, of course, you need to prepare. What does that mean? Go on the company website, try to, understand as much about the business as you can. What they do, what the products they sell, sort of their geographical layout, the size of the company, as much as you can get. And also really study the job description. And then, try to anticipate the questions that you're going to get from the interviewer and write them down and, write out your responses. Like some of the questions you just know you're going to get, like they're in every interview. Like tell us a little bit about your background. What attracted you to this job? And you're probably going to get asked questions about the specific elements of the job description, what are the requirements of the job? They're going to ask you, well, have you ever done this before? So those you're going to get, write them out. But here's the key. Say them out loud, rehearse them out loud. And the reason why that's so important is because, for every question you ever get, there's just going to be certain things you're going to stumble over, certain concepts that are just sort of, you're going to find hard to say. And if you say them out loud, you know what those are going to be and you kind of work them out. So when you're actually in the interview, it's just going to flow better. That's a key one. The other thing is, when you're asked about your experience, tell us about your background, don't just go through, your prior employers, your job titles, where you went to college or wherever, grad school, whatever, kind of like you're reading off your resume. Instead, talk about, what you did in each job, accomplishments, experiences you had. And if you can, tell like a little story, like that's the kind of thing that's going to grab the interviewer's attention, as opposed to just kind of just listing off all the jobs you've had. That just doesn't work. The other key point is you got to make sure you come with good questions. And don't just have sort of generic questions that you would ask any employer. Have the questions, tailored to that particular business. Like really, again, go through the website and that way the interviewer will know that, you invested the time and you've thought through like things that, could confront you in that job with that particular employer. And then last but not least, write a thank you note. There's a debate about whether that even helps, whether they care, anybody even reads those. The bottom line is it can't hurt. And for some interviewers, it does help. They kind of look for that. And at very least, it gives you one more touch point, after the interview, just so they'll remember you. So those are the things you should do. And now for the three, killer mistakes, the three things you don't want to do in a job interview. So number one, and I think this is the one that is the most important because this truly is just such a turnoff. And this is the one I see most often, which is you don't want to give long, rambly answers. You don't want to go on and on and on in answer to any one particular question. I've had folks, in response to the question, tell me a little bit about your background. They talk for 20 minutes. And sometimes I try to interject, but they just keep going. And so usually you have about a half hour for the interview, and the interviewer has their list of questions, and they know they might not get through all of them, but they at least want to get through most of them. So if you're just as the interviewee just going on and on and on, and they only get to two of their questions, I can guarantee you're not going to get the job. It's just when that happens, and I'm interviewing somebody and they just can't get to the point. I just think to myself, like, what's it going to be like with this person, when they're working for me and, they're in my office and we're working through something and they just don't shut up. They just go on. And so one of the things you want to do is in the practice part of this, when you're preparing and you do, sort of talk out loud, time yourself, make sure For the background question, tell us about yourself. That one you're going to, of course, take a little longer, and that's okay. But don't take 10 minutes on that. Don't take 15 minutes on that. Like try to get that down to like maybe 4 minutes or 5 minutes. So again, that's just part of the preparation process. The next one is, and this one is kind of hard to describe. I'll have to give some examples. Don't try to like be clever or quirky or sort of cute, doing something to like really make you remember them. You're on a job interview. You want to be professional. So let me give you an example. I was interviewing for a position. When I had my law practice, I was interviewing attorneys for a position as an associate. And this one candidate, she interviewed fine. She wasn't great, but she was decent. But she did something in the interview that was just kind of odd. Like, sort of halfway through the interview, and it came out of nowhere, she said, I'm gonna show you a card trick. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. So she pulls out a deck of cards and she did this trick. And I didn't see how it tied to anything we were talking about. And she says something like, well, I just thought you'd enjoy that. And I said, oh, thank you. And it was just weird. It was kind of out of nowhere. It didn't help. It made me like think to myself like, that was just kind of odd. And I don't think that was like, I didn't say like, okay, well, I would never hire her because of that. But it definitely was a little bit of a turnoff. And, given that she wasn't a stellar interviewee, on that one, I didn't end up following up with her. Another example was, I had a guy and I interviewed him and, he was kind of a colorful person. I think he was kind of funny, humorous, but it was a little too much, And at one point he said something that was, I guess was kind of funny. Then he said like, ba-dum-bum, kind of like highlighting the fact that he thought he said something funny, kind of like he was like Jack Benny or, in today's world, Dave Chappelle. It's like you're not interviewing for like a stand-up comedy role. So, again, another one I'll mention, when I was working at the big downtown law firm in Boston, we would take job candidates out to lunch, especially like when I was a junior associate, folks that were interviewing for summer associate jobs, we would take them out to lunch. So my office mate and I took out this one candidate, for lunch, and she was fine. We had a pleasant lunch, but she ate all her food with her fingers, and she ordered a salad. It's like, it was just kind of weird, It was almost very distracting. Like, you're talking to her and you're trying to focus on what they're saying. All you see her is like picking up her lettuce. It's like dripping with, dressing. And then she's like wipes her hands. And, and after the interview, I said to my colleague, Susan, I was like, do you notice anything weird about that, that lunch? And she's like, yeah, the fact that she ate her salad with her hands. And it was just so apparent. Again, I don't know if she got the job or not. I was, Susan and I just took her out to lunch, and she had this candidate had like 5 interviews before us. So I don't know if she got the job or not, but it did not help our perception of her, put it that way. So that's the second one. The third one is, don't be pushy in the post-interview period. The bottom line is, when we're looking for jobs, we all want to get the call back. We all want to get the offer. We're anxious. We want to hear back. But you got to be patient. You got to resist the temptation to, check in. I think it's fine to do that at most once, particularly if it's been, more than, I would say, a week or two. If you're in your second week and you haven't heard, I think it's okay to, send an email. But at most. What you don't want to do is, a few days after the interview, check in and then check in again and again. And I know it sounds like I'm kind of making that like, who would do that? You'd be surprised. I've had candidates do that, more than once. And it's just such a turnoff. You get this email. It's like, hey, you said you thought you might get back to me by the end of the week. Now it's Monday, and I haven't heard, so just wondering, and they'll check in like every, few days or every week. And it's like, to me, that is a door closer. If they're doing that, it's like first of all, it's just a lack of people skills. Like they got to realize that's kind of annoying. And secondly, if they're that pushy as a job candidate, what are they going to be like as an employee? Like I was kind of like, that's a red flag. And here's the bottom line with all these things is, you work really hard to get an interview. Like it's these days, I think it's hard just to get the interview. So, if you get it, first of all, it's definitely worth the time to prepare. Invest that extra time to prepare. And secondly, don't do these things that are just going to be automatic door closers. So anyway, if this video helped you, please do hit the subscribe button. But also check out this other video I did. It's kind of related. It's the title is the one trait you need for success. So check that out. And that's it for now. And we'll see you next time.